In the last 500 years, Filipinos have fought for freedom, unity, and equality. We have made our mark in many fields, from science and medicine to culture and the arts. We are beacons of creativity, resourcefulness, resiliency, and compassion. In 2021, the Filipino people will join the world in commemorating one of the greatest achievements of mankind, the first circumnavigation of the world. We celebrate this historic achievement by bannering an important message. Over adversity and struggles, we shall triumph, putting humanity first, always.
Kasama tayo sa lubungin ng kinabukasan. Be
ng puso, sa dibdib ko'y buhay. Hindi sumusuko sa hirap matlumbay, sa mga manlulupi hindi pasisi, duyan ang magigiti, hindi papi. Kabuti ay batig, 500 taon ng daluyot yanig, tayo bumabangon, isang puso pa rin, isang alap sa dilim, iba't ibang man ang mga bituin, sa isang kalawakan magniningning, magkahawak kamay sa lilim ng bughaw na langit, umaawit. Mabaon man sa putik, matapos ang bagyo, lahat magkakabit-bisig, patuloy na sumusulong, isang puso pa rin.
Mandirigmang Pilipino ang lahi ko, bayaning Pilipino sa makabagong panahon.
by the Office of the President of the Philippines and the National Quincentennial Committee in anticipation of the 2021 Quincentennial Commemorations in the Philippines. So this is a series of online lectures which aims to sustain the Filipinos' interest to the 500th anniversary of the victory at Mactan, the Philippine part in the first circumnavigation of the world, and other related events in 2021 in this time of COVID-19 pandemic. Una po, maraming salamat po sa lahat ng sumusubaybay ngayon. Gayon din sa mga katuwang nating ahensya na kaagapay namin upang maisakatuparan ng programang ito. Ang National Historical Commission of the Philippines, Presidential Communications Operations Office, the Radio-Television Malacañang, Department of Foreign Affairs, and the Department of Education. So we are live via Facebook pages of the National Quincentennial Committee, NHCP, PCOO, RTVM, NCCA, DFA, and DepEd. So please do not forget to share this live stream to your friends and like our Facebook page, facebook.com/NQC2021, or follow us at NQC2021 on Twitter and Instagram. And subscribe to our YouTube channel, National Quincentennial Committee, for more educational materials. Also, follow our playlist on Spotify, 500 Years Philippines, to access the official soundtrack of the Quincentennial Commemorations. So kasama ko rin po ngayong araw na ito ang isa sa aking mga kasamahan sa NQC Secretariat, si Binibining Jubilin Yerpes. Good morning, Jobs.
Hi, maraming salamat, Ayesha. Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. Ilan lamang pong paalala, maaari niyo pong gamitin ang Quincentennial Online Lecture Portal sa panonood ng lecture na ito. Mapapanood niyo rin po Sa nasabing portal ang lahat ng lectures ng NQC at ng iba pang partner institutions natin. Ang e-certificate doon. Ang kailangan nyo lang pong gawin ay mag-sign up sa portal.nqc.gov.ph at tumutok sa live stream ng lecture na ito sa nasabing portal. Again, portal.nqc.gov.ph sa mga gustong makakuha ng certificate. Mahalaga po na doon din kayo sa portal manood ng lecture live stream na ito. Ngayon ay atin pong lecture ngayon ay pang-11 ng countdown to 500 online lecture, no? Balikan po natin ang mga unang lektura. Noong June 12, naganap ang ating unang lecture kung saan tinalakay ni Dr. Vic Torres ng De La Salle University kung papaanong naging isa sa mga inspirasyon si Lapu-lapu at ang makta ng panahon ni Mabini para lumaya sa mga Kastila. Sa ikalawang lektura naman ni Dr. Kirby Alvarez sa UP Diliman, tinalakay naman niya papaano binawi ni na Rizal at ng kanyang henerasyon ang alaala na meron tayo tungkol sa ating mga ninuno na nooy minamaliit ng mga mananakop, kaya tuloy ang tingin natin sa ating sarili ay maliit at mababa. Sa ikatlong lektura naman ni Dr. April Hope Castro, tinalakay ang papel ng Pilipinas sa pagpapaningas sa apoy ng kalayaan sa Asya na para kay Mabini, ito ang liwanag na dapat tamhin ng mga kalahi natin upang bumangon at maibalik ang matandang kalayaan. Sa ika-4 na lektura naman ni Dr. Rolando Borinaga, tinalakay ang mga posibleng pagkain na kinain ni Magellan habang sila'y nasa Kabisayaan 500 years ago. Sa ikalimang lektura naman ni Professor Van Ibianas ay tinalakay ang ating mga ninuno at ang kalakalang pandaigdig bago dumating ang mga Espanyol. Sa ika-6 na lektura naman ay tinalakay ni Dr. Ricardo Jose kung paano tinulungan ng Pilipinas sa pamamagitan ni Pangulong Manuel Quezon ang mga Hudyo noong panahon ng ikalawang digmaang pandaigdig. Dito, ipinakita ang likas sa pagiging compassionate ng nating mga Pilipino na kung titingnan natin sa ating kasaysayan, ang compassion na ito ang ipinakita rin ng ating mga ninuno sa gutom at may sakit na mga tauhan ng Magellan-Elcano Expedition. Sa ika-7 lektura naman ay tinalakay ni Mr. Ian Alfonso ang huling Spanish Governor General ng Pilipinas. Sa ating pong ika-8 lecture ay tinalakay naman ni Professor Hani Badilles kung paano nabuhay ang sanduguan sa Diandi o prosesong pangkapayapaan ng mga lumad sa Sarangani. Ang ika-9 na lecture naman po natin ay patungkol sa mga sinaunang aso sa Pilipinas. Sa atin naman po ika-10 lecture ay nakapanayam natin ng mga cluster representatives ng NHCP Museums at ipinakilala sa atin ng History Museums under the National Historical Commission of Philippines. Sa lecture po natin ngayon ay tatalakayin ang kahalagahan ng paggamit ng periodisasyon sa pagsusulat ng kasaysayang pambansa at kasaysayang lokal at bakit preokupasyon ng mga historiador ang paglalapat ng konseptong ito sa pagbubuo ng kasaysayan. Kaugnay nito, nais ding ibahagi sa publiko ang natatanging kasaysayan ng Cordillera. Sa lahat po ng nanonood, kung sakali po na habang nagtatalakay ang ating speaker ay magkaroon kayo ng katanungan, feel free to ask questions through the comment section of this live stream and we will accommodate them at the latter part of the lecture. Narito po muli si Binibining Ayesha para ipakilala ang ating tagapagsalita para sa araw na to. Back to you, Ms. Ayesha.
Thank you, Jose. Our resource speaker for today took her PhD in Philippine Studies at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. She was a Fulbright Scholar in Residence for fall term 2016 to spring term 2017 at the University of Memphis, Lambeth, Jackson, Tennessee, USA. She was also a Senior Fulbright Fellow in 2008 at the Department of History and Center of Southeast Asian Studies, University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. She was the head of the National Committee for Historical Research of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts in 2011 to 2013 and UP Baguio from 2002 to 2009. She is a member of the Honor Society of Phi Kappa Phi, University of the Philippines chapter, and the co-president and lifetime member of the Philippine National Historical Society. Her research interests, publications, and scholarly outputs were focused on social history, ethnohistory, Southeast Asian historiographies, Cordillera history, and comparative history of Asian indigenous peoples. She is currently a professor of history and the chairperson of the Department of History and Philosophy of the College of Social Sciences at the University of the Philippines, Baguio City. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome Dr. Marianela Florendo.
Thank you, Ayesha, for the introduction. And I would also like to thank the NHCP for this opportunity to discuss the Cordillera and its history. This is, in a way, refocusing the discussion from mainstream Manila-centric history to a history of the margins and from the margins. I want to acknowledge my colleagues at UP Baguio and our students enrolled in History 3 who are attending this webinar. History of Ethnic Communities in the Philippines with focus on the Cordillera is one of our niche courses in UP Baguio. And another one is the History of Northern Luzon. I hope that after this lecture, everyone is stimulated to continue learning about the Cordillera and the indigenous peoples so that we may have a complete and relevant history of the Filipino people. The recognition of our diversity as peoples is not at all antithetical or contradictory to a national identity. So let us begin. We are all familiar with such terms as ancient, modern, Renaissance, medieval, classical period, and we also hear about the period of the Enlightenment, period of decay or decline, period of progress, golden age, dark ages, stages of human life, four seasons, and agricultural cycle. In the case of Philippine history, we talk about pre-colonial, the Spanish period, the American period, the Japanese occupation, followed by the different post-World War II presidencies from Manuel Rojas to the Duterte administration. Notice that when a municipality, a province, a city, or a barangay issues a souvenir program to celebrate its foundation day, the history of the locality is based on political administrations. All this exemplify the division of the past into segments of time. It could be ages, epochs, stages, administrations, and so on. We call this periodization in history. So periodization is therefore the division of the past into segments of time. One of the elements of history as a field of study is its preoccupation with time, the temporal element as we call it, so that periodizing history has been a response to that element of history which is time. Now, according to Barraclough, periodization problems in the writing of history. Why should it be a problem? That's because other historians like Gerard, Besson would say that periodization is problematic because it's arbitrary, it's artificial, it's unavoidable. And Benedetto Croce would say periodization time is something intrinsic to history. Anyhow, periodization lends intelligibility. Now, I will try to abbreviate my discussion of periodization and instead classify of periodization, historians' views of periodization. one group of historians posits that there were really no radical breaks to history. So that when we say ancient and we talk about shifting to the medieval, then shifting to the modern, there are no clear cut-offs to these specific periods. Instead, Freeman of Oxford would say there is a unity of history. Now, Fernand Braudel, I'm sure many of us are familiar with Fernand Braudel and his concept of long-term or longue durée. Now, many of the speculative philosophies of history theorize on the relation of events and therefore try to relate come up with the relation of events to each other. Now, the other category of other group of historians now would consider change as the focus of history. And when one focuses on change, definitely it is intrinsic that history becomes compartmentalized as we try to take note of nodal points that usher in change. And when change is ushered in, definitely we talk about one period in history. So periodization for this group of historians would be considered as some kind of a handle to group, to organize events. Now, let me say that even when, regardless of the approach we are now taking on discussing history, whether it's diachronic or synchronic, diachronic, when we study different periods and relate them to each other, and when we say synchronic, we try to pick on a particular period and discuss this, we still deal with periodization. Now, it is worth noting that when we talk about periodization in history, since it's something that arbitrary, it's not something fixed, periodization therefore reflects the historian's perspective. It is the historian, therefore, who defines what events are considered significant, which events are considered nodal points, and therefore periodization is the historian's creation. Now let's move to periodization in relation to Philippine history. Periodization becomes, or shall I say, periodization is also reflective of our national narrative. So in as much as we're presenting, we are preparing for the quincentennial of the arrival of Spain, I should say of the introduction of Christianity here in the Philippines, my discussion now focuses on the Philippines under Spain. Now, there is usually emphasis on national history because national history provides a unifying thread. After World War II, one preoccupation of Southeast Asians was the rewriting of their histories, the rewriting of national histories that would now dislodge colonial histories. Why was that the case? Because a national narrative would now give a sense of identity to new nations after World War II. Now, however, it is worth noting that a national history tends to be homogenizing and generalizing, meaning it does not really take into consideration the diversities in terms of nuanced contexts as well as responses of people to certain events. And that's the reason why there is a need, therefore, to move from national narratives to a refocusing on local as well as regional histories. If we look at some periodizations of Philippine history, I just chose some periodizations. If we were to look at the administrative history of the Philippines, then we could probably start with the period when Spain arrived in the Philippines. Usually it's not 1521 that would be significant, but 1565, because that is when the arrival of Miguel Lopez de Legazpi therefore established the Philippines as a formal colony of Spain. And the first thing which the Spaniards declared was the Regalian Doctrine, where the territories now were supposed to be territories of the King of Spain. Now, from the arrival of the Spaniards from Cebu to Manila, where Manila now became the locus of power of the colonizers, reduction was undertaken. And when we say reduction, this was a comprehensive reduction program, meaning it entailed physical, spatial, geographic relocation of people that resulted in conversion, that resulted, snowballed to political consolidation of Spain's colony. And from here, we now have the erect would culminate in a very intricate bureaucracy. And so we now have this table representing layers, bureaucratic layers in the administration of the Philippines as a colony of Spain. Now, another form of periodization would be periodizing the economic developments during the colonial period, Spanish colonial period. And this periodization would now come from O.D. Corpus' Philippine Economic History. And here we start off with the native economy until we are integrated into the global market, into the world market order, and we develop a dual economy according to O.D. Corpus. So that was the periodization of the economic developments during the Spanish colonial period. And another periodization would be that of the history of resistances. Some would say the history of nationalism. Now, some historians would try to look at the different responses to the Spanish colonial period, colonial regime, by looking at the buildup of different resistances, from sporadic resistances to nativistic resistances to the blend of Christian and indigenous concepts that would now bring about millenarian movements. Then the reform movement, according to Benedict Anderson, we needed a print capitalism in order, and he was referring, of course, to the period of reform, the period of the propaganda, in order for the Filipinos to get stimulated to another higher level of resistance against Spain, and that would now be the revolution. Now, I would end with the revolution, although we know that we hardly consolidated the freedom that we achieved, because after the 1896 revolution, what followed would now be the Spanish-American War that delivered us to the Philippine-American War. And even with the official declaration of the end of the Philippine-American War, we know that resistances continued. So that would now be the history of resistances. Now, if you see this 1872 in this particular slide, that's because if we follow also the framework of Teodoro Agoncillo, nationalism in the Philippines would start with 1872 and would build up until we now have the revolution of 1896. So here you can see that even just with the history of resistances and the history of nationalism, there are already several ways of periodizing and looking at events in our history. Now, these are all national narratives. These are all periodizations of a national history. Now, I'd like to ask, because I've been assigned to tackle the Cordillera history, where is the Cordillera in the national narrative? In the same manner as where are other histories, let's say histories of Mindanao, histories of the Visayas, local histories, regional histories, sectoral histories, in the national narratives. And so let me focus now on the Cordillera and its unique conditions during the period of Spanish colonialism. Now, let me start. This is a little very remote, but in this particular table, you will note that maybe you'll just have to go to the bottom of the page, bottom of the slide. Why in the first place did we get ourselves differentiated? So from the presence of a core population, the development of a base culture, eventually the different areas in the Philippines moved toward ethnicization. Historian Samuel Caytan would say that ethnicization of the Filipinos would be traced to the 4th to the 11th centuries. So this differentiation now would lead to what we call the ethnic synthesis. And so we have now, following Samuel Caytan's categorization of the different ethnic groups that evolved, we now have in northern Luzon, you have the Iloco, and then the uplands, that's the Cordillera. Then there was a Pangasinan, Zambales ethnic synthesis, Bataan, Kapampangan, the Tagalogs, the Bicol ethnic synthesis, the Visayas, and also the uplands in the Visayas. Then Samuel Caytan of Combes for Mindanao. Now, from this ethnic synthesis, Filipinos start responses and adaptations to their ecological environment. Now, at this point, I would zero in on the common reference to the people of the Cordilleras, the Igorot, the word Igorot, which comes from the prefix E and from the root word Golot. Now, in pre-colonial times, Igolot simply was something geographic. If you belong to the highlands, then you were an Igolot. William Henry Scott would say that the etymology of the word Igorot would be something indigenous. It would be indigenous. Igolot, a Highlander, someone from the highlands. So it has not, during the pre-colonial period, the Igolot would be a term that simply referred to the place of origin of a particular person. In contrast to, of course, Igolot, Igorot now being transformed to other derogatory meanings. Now, during the pre-colonial times, I'd like to say that the types of community that existed in the Cordillera would now be this. Again, this is taken from William Henry Scott's Cracks in the Parchment Curtain. There were warrior societies, petty plutocracies, subsistence, classless villages in the Cordillera. Unlike, for instance, the more advanced sultanates, Muslim organizations down in Mindanao. Now, when the European colonizers, when Spain arrived in the Philippines, then following now its reduction program, so we have here Northern Luzon in 1625, then you can see the villages here, the communities that were already known to chroniclers. The first geographic division of the Philippines when the Spanish arrived would now be based on religious geography. So the whole northern Luzon would now be considered the bishopric of Nueva Segovia. If you look at this table again, you look at this table from Robles, you'll note that the Philippines was subdivided to 4 bishoprics. Now, where did the Cordillera physically belong? It belonged to Nueva Segovia, but this table would not reflect the Cordillera. There was just the Ilocos, Pangasinan, and Cagayan areas. When we say Cagayan here, we're not referring to the province of Cagayan today, but we're referring to Cagayan, which would subsume the current Cagayan, Isabela, Nueva Vizcaya. So even in this table, the Cordillera is invisible, in other words. But when reduction was undertaken, the Cordillera experienced reduction from the west via the Ilocos, from the Ilocos, where the Augustinians were based, and from the east, the Cagayan Valley area, where the Dominicans were based. So there was religious geography. The Augustinians established missions in the west, while the Dominicans established their missions in the east. Eventually, of course, the Dominicans would take over some of the Augustinian missions in the west. So here would now be a map. It's not complete, but you'll find that both Augustinians and Dominicans attempted to establish mission centers in the Cordillera. Here you will find one particular church. This was, of course, already taken in 1920. This is a church in western portion of the Cordillera. It's known as Cayan, and Cayan would now be accessible from the lowlands, from the Ilocos, via Cervantes or via Tagudin, via Candon. So an early mission was established in this particular area. But you'll note the landscape in the Cordillera and where this mission now was established. Now, one as host of a mission would be Cervantes, and here you can see an old church of Cervantes. Now, again, Cervantes would be accessible from the west via Tagudin or Candon, Ilocos Sur. And in the north, these are now churches in Apayao, in Kapinatan, and in Pudtol. note that in Apayao, these churches were constructed as early as the 1600s by the Dominican missions that were based in Cagayan. Note that the bishopric of Nueva Segovia had its capital in Lalo, Cagayan, before it was transferred to Vigan. And here you can see another church legacy again of the Dominican missions in Cagayan. This used to be part of, this is now Rizal. It used to be called Malaweg and would be in the fringes of Apayao, Kalinga, bordering Cagayan. It's now part of Cagayan. Instead of Malaweg, it's now known as Rizal. Now, why am I showing this? Because this would show attempts on the part of the Spanish colonizers. I would, of course, include, since there was the union of the church and state at that particular time, that there was partnership, collaboration between the church and the state in reducing the peoples of the Cordilleras. But even with these attempts, you'll note that there are no plaza complexes in the Cordillera. We could attribute this to the physical environment in the Cordillera, the character of the Cordillera indigenous societies that were very protective of their traditions, so that when they observed the encroachments, the conversions taking place, indigenous institutions tried to make sure that the people upheld their institutions. Now, the other is, of course, we see the sustained resistance. Resistance was but simply resistance to protect their lands from being part of the Christian political order, and at the same time protecting their lands from encroachments resulting from conversion and also from being integrated into the colonial polity. So this was a paper which I presented and last year to highlight that if we were to look at responses of Filipinos to Spanish colonialism, then we cannot generalize. We cannot come up with a national narrative. Responses will have to be nuanced so that you find these nuanced histories in local histories, regional histories. And I'm happy that the NHCP included a lecture, not a lecture of a region that does not coincide with accommodation and acceptance of Spanish institutions, Christian institutions, but to highlight a region that responded differently to Spanish colonialism. Now, let's look at the colonial perspective of transforming the colony. Now, note that when the colonizers undertook censuses, they were counting almas or souls. So the pagan Igorots were not part of that census. Because if you were not converted, then supposedly you're not part of the counting of the almas. Instead, you belong to the population of the infieles. Now, the Spaniards also considered acts that were anti-colonial. Anything that was anti-colonial was considered criminalidad, according to Greg Bankoff. And therefore, the behaviors of the people of the Cordillera were classified as criminalidad. Why? They were anti-colonial simply because they did not want to get themselves converted. They did not want to pay tributes. They knew that if they get converted, then definitely they will have to comply with the obligations of a Christian. So what happened further with the Cordillera? Those who remontados and alzados, those who would now revert to the pre-Christian social order, would seek refuge in the Cordillera. And so eventually, the Cordillera was considered to be a haven of heathens, apostate Indians, and criminals. So Governor De Lara, for instance, would say the Cordillera was a refuge of rebels. But how did, and maybe I can cite more, what was the mentality of the colonial administrators? They knew that the Cordillera was host to many mines. In fact, when as early as the 1500s, late 1500s, Juan de Salcedo visited the Ilocos and found out about the gold in the Ilocos. And immediately, they tried to trace the source of the gold in the Ilocos, and they traced it to the Cordillera. And so many expeditions to the gold mines, to locate the gold mines of the Igorots, were launched by the Spaniards in the 1600s. Now, the Spanish colonizers were not successful in penetrating the mines in the Cordillera, so that even in 1619, there was the debate on launching just wars against the peoples of the Cordillera. The people of the Cordillera had so much gold, they had resources, and they had to be shared. That was the justification of the just wars. The peoples of the Cordillera could not, therefore, just solely benefit from their resources. They had to share the resources. And that was the debate on the just wars. Both Spanish colonizers as well as the church, the religious, participated in this particular debate. Now, in 1642, to annihilate the peoples of the Cordillera who refused to be reduced, there was the Ordinance of Good Government that was declared. And what was one of the provisions of this Ordinance of Good Government? It was preventing or proscribing any form of lowland and upland interaction. And we know that in pre-colonial times, the lowlands and the uplands freely traded with each other. The people of the Cordillera would go down to the lowlands for such items like salt. And they also went down to the lowlands for their weaves. And in return, when they bought these items, the Cordillerans would bring down the gold as their way of paying for these items. Now, in 1688, Don Fausto Cruzat, Gobernadorcillo of Manila, even reinforced the Ordinance of Good Government, and now declared that any interaction with the uplanders would receive a punishment of 100 lashes. Now, these are just some of the policies of the Spaniards towards the peoples of the Cordillera, the unpacified peoples of the Cordilleras, that would show now how the Spanish colonizers looked at this particular region. Now, how did the indigenous peoples of the Cordillera react to the colonial social order? Now, I was able to gather a lot of these views, but I could just mention some. Like, by the time the missions centers were established, many of the peoples of the Cordilleras were worried about the missions. So while they did not live in the mission, or they did not surround the mission centers to create a plaza complex, many of the indigenous peoples were worried, in the sense that, if I may recall one particular conversation, the indigenous people said, so now that the fathers know where we are, know our lands, where else can we hide? So they also had views about the Christian social order, the rituals of the ceremonies within the context of the Christian social order. And they would say, well, that's not the case here in the Cordillera. When we have our rituals, everyone is involved. In the lowlands, it is the colonial order that specifies who becomes gobernadorcillo, who becomes the head. But here in the Cordillera, we have our own indigenous leaders. So for them, they were convinced that the better order was the indigenous social order. We can find many of these conversations, many of these views of the indigenous peoples already in Spanish sources, in the documentations of the Dominican fathers who established their mission centers in the Cordillera. Then the indigenous peoples also wondered, who were these white men, referring to the Spaniards? White men with very white teeth, because in contrast to the Cordilleras, to the Igorots, who chewed betel nut and had their teeth tinted red because of chewing betel nut, or what we call moma in the Cordillera. So they would say, who are these white men with white teeth, in contrast to the red teeth of the people in the Cordillera? And why are they so covered? Of course, that is in contrast to the Cordillerans who wore the bahag, or the G-string, translated as the G-string. And why do they wear shoes? Why are their feet covered? Because, of course, they were barefooted. I mean, the indigenous peoples were walked on bare feet. So they really saw themselves, they differentiated themselves from the Spanish colonizers, from the lowlanders who imbibed the new Christian social order. That would now be the indigenous views of Spanish colonialism. Now, take note that until this time, I have not discussed anything about direct colonialism in the Cordillera. While from 1565 until the 1800s, we already speak of the successful reduction in many parts of the country. In the Cordillera, reduction, however, was not successful. Perhaps there were some Igorots who were attracted to go down to the lowlands, but they were not fully integrated into the pueblos. Instead, they formed villages in the borders of, I should say, in the slopes, the borders of the Ilocos, of the lowlands, and the Cordillera. And eventually, these particular communities of the Igorots were called rancherias by the Spanish administrators. Now, direct colonialism came about only in the 1800s when, well, Julian Malumbres of the Dominican order, who would have several memorias and relaciones about the peoples of Northern Luzon, would use the term Igorotismo, in which case this area of the Cordillera now was associated with an unpacified collective people who exhibited what he called Igorotismo. And of course, I'm not trying to relate that Malumbres Igorotismo was now the reason for the creation of two important special political units by the Spaniards that would cater to an unpacified region. And first, in 1810, there was the creation of the País de los Igorotes, meaning a recognition that this area would now be the country of the Igorots. Some documentations, in fact, make use of the word nation, Igorot nation, which would be a recognition of the autonomy of the peoples of the Cordillera. Then in 1895, there was now the creation of the comandancias politico-militar all over the País de los Igorotes. So here in this particular map, you will see now the subdivisions of the Cordillera to the comandancias politico-militar during the late 1800s. Now, it's interesting to note that if the first comandancia in the Cordillera was established in Lepanto in 1852. 4 years later, the first mining claim in the Cordillera was established. This was 4 years after the establishment of a comandancia in Lepanto, operated by Tomas Balbas y Castro. In 1856, the first mining claim was the Sociedad Minero Metalúrgica Cantabro Filipina de Mangkayan. So that the map here would show where the mineral district is. From, again, the Ilocos, from the coast of the Ilocos, there was a Spanish trail that brought the claimants to the uplands. Here you still find the remnants of the Spanish trail. And then here on the right side, you will have an aerial view of the Lepanto Consolidated Mines, which should now be a company that would, a contemporary mining company that would trace its roots to 1856. So we can say that the establishment of the Comandancia Politico-Militar, as well as the first mining claim to be established in the Cordillera, would now be indicators of direct control over the Cordillera. So all this time, if we were to look at, therefore, periodizing the developments in the Cordillera, I've come up with these various periodizations. We will note that these periodizations are very distinct from the national narrative which I presented a while ago. So here, if we look at the region remained uncolonized, the way we would treat, for instance, pueblos in the lowlands and other areas in the Philippines. William Henry Scott would say, by the 1800s, the region was still composed of tribus independientes. Of course, he said, well, not because he believed in the application of the word tribus, which refers to a collective that is family, kinship-based, but that he wanted to emphasize how autonomous the peoples in the Cordillera were, even in the late 1800s. And Primo de Rivera would now claim that in 1880 that it was very humiliating for Spain at this particular time that it has not successfully consolidated its territory, that there were still non-Christian towns that were backward, that committed crimes. Of course, this would now be from the perspective of the Spanish colonizers. So if we look at the political history of the Cordillera, periodizing it from a political history framework, you'll note also that, well, it was only in the 1800s that the Spaniards came up with an official way of addressing the unpacified area by establishing a special military unit. Now, of course, if we look at the developments, was the Cordillera integrated into the revolutionary government, etc.? That's also another interesting research. I think the National Historical Commission of the Philippines will be coming up with a publication on a regional conference which we held on how the Cordillera, for instance, reacted to Aguinaldo when he traversed the Cordillera from Cervantes in the Ilocos to Palanan, Isabela, where he eventually, well, some would say surrendered or where he got captured. So that's also very interesting. What about the economic history of the Cordillera? How do we periodize it? Not the way O.D. Corpus would periodize Philippine economic developments during the Spanish period. The Cordillera remained, there was a breadth of different forms of the economy in the Cordillera. Much earlier, I already presented the social hierarchy that would more or less also give us an idea of the kind of economy which the Cordillera had. But what about the Cordillera in relation, for instance, to economic policies that affected Northern Luzon? Well, Ed De Jesus, in his book on the tobacco monopoly, would now note the role of the Cordillera, the peoples of the Cordillera, in the tobacco monopoly. So cash crop production, specialization, cash crop, specialized production. Did the Cordillera participate? Now, for lack of time, I just wish to mention briefly that yes, the Cordillera participated in the tobacco monopoly, not officially, but illegally from the perspective of the Spanish colonizers. Illegally because it was from the Cordillera that farmers, for instance, from the lowlands, smuggled tobacco produced from the Cordillera in order for them to meet their vandalas and also their tributes. So for some lowland farmers, they had to produce food instead of tobacco. And usually to meet their vandalas, to meet their taxes, they would now resort to having tobacco smuggled to the lowlands so that this would now take care of whatever quotas they needed to submit. Now, if we were to talk about resistances, all throughout the history of Spain in the Philippines, the Cordillera peoples, although fragmented in their responses, had sustained resistances against conversion, against Spanish encroachments. And we can interpret these staunch resistances as ways of defending their ancestral lands, their mines, and at the same time, their indigenous institutions. The only piece of evidence that would show a supra-community level response to the Spanish period, to the Spanish regime, would be in 1881 and 1895, when there were resistances that took place in Bontoc, in the Sagada area, in the Tadyan area, so all in the western section. Now, we take note that what could have stimulated this resistance was that Bontoc was the site of a Spanish garrison. And so it was therefore the object of attack on the part of some of supra-community resistances in the Western Cordillera. Now, one interesting question would be, while Manila and its environs were launching the revolutionary movement, what was happening in the Cordillera? Were they part of the national revolution? Or did they even have this sense of a national anti-colonial movement? Now, in a previous a spectator, a mere spectator, rather than a participant in this particular movement. Yes, there are documentations on indigenous peoples and their contacts with the revolutionary forces, but did that make them part of the revolutionary movement? Was there a sense of a national revolutionary movement to which Cordillera resistances were now attached? So that would be worth studying. Now, what about the history of urbanization in the Cordillera? We can also come up with a periodization, but as I mentioned a while ago, there were hardly pueblos, plaza complexes from which urbanization could have taken off. Of course, the most urbanized areas in the Cordillera at that particular time would be Bontoc and, of course, La Trinidad. Baguio, surprisingly, was not attractive to the Spaniards. They were more attracted to the valleys of La Trinidad, Benguet, rather than the rolling landscape of Baguio. If they had to go to Baguio, it was just as a passage to the mines in Benguet. Of course, there are other histories that would generate a unique periodization, like an environmental history of the Cordillera. You can think of other themes, historical themes, and periodize those themes from the unique conditions in the Cordillera. Now, I would now adopt terms. The term pericolonialism. The Cordillera in the context of pericolonialism. Pericolonialism has been used well in literature to refer to remaining as peripheral. Yes, during the time of Spanish colonialism, the Cordillera was peripheral to the colonial order. Peripheral in the whole of, as in the relationship to the colonialist or post-colonialist axis, or any dualistic thinking. So pericolonialism, because we talk of integration into the colonial order, pericolonialism being outside the orbit of colonialism, being at the periphery, being at the margins. Now, the term pericolonialism has been used by Stephen Acabado in his Archaeology of Pericolonialism, Responses of the Unconquered to Spanish Conquest and Colonialism in Ifugao, and Una Paredes on her studies of the Lumad. And I also feel that it is worth considering in the context of Cordillera history. So, what's the challenge? If we have a national narrative that is not exactly, that doesn't exactly capture the nuances of our diverse histories, what's the challenge? Then we go back to local histories. Local histories and regional histories. So that local and regional histories have the potential of addressing the imbalances of a national history. Local history is nuanced, but we're reminded by Resil Mojares in one speech, keynote speech decades ago, where he noticed that many of our local histories are mere translations of national events. That doesn't have to be the case. In other words, if we look at local history as just finding, for instance, Katipunan chapters, trying to find national translations in the local context, then we're not creating periodization that is attuned to the distinct developments in localities, so that our local history should be able to generate a periodization based on important events in a particular community. Events that would now, a periodization that would be reflective of the collective experience of the people in the community. And here we take into consideration also capturing the transformations, trying to adapt our research methodologies to methodologies that would capture the indigenous voices. But even when we have to undertake local histories that are nuanced, that are distinct, let us not also forget that local history should not be treated as self-contained. Local history would always be attached to a broader context. So that when doing local histories, yes, we take into consideration distinct developments in the Cordillera. Their way of periodizing sometimes is not by virtue of administrations. They periodize what is considered memorable to them would be epidemics. Why epidemics? Because when there are epidemics in the Cordillera, then they have to look for other locations for habitation. They transfer their houses. So usually when you find a house, a native hut in the Cordillera, and usually the traditional hut, it would indicate there the date of the construction of that particular hut. And if you were to trace the history of that particular house, then the owner would say, well, we built this house because we have to move from our former village because there was a disaster, there was an epidemic there, and we had to leave the village. Then there are other significant indigenous ways of determining temporality, periodization. What else are memorable? The construction of roads. What else? In Ifugao, for instance, the construction of the Hagabi. The Hagabi is this, maybe you've seen this. This is the elite, let me just say, elite share, whereby the whole community, what makes it a nodal point, the community usually is involved in the construction of the Hagabi, where you find feasting when it gets constructed, usually by elites of the community. And in a lifetime, an Ifugao would remember the construction of a Hagabi because probably in his lifetime, there's just one Hagabi that gets constructed. And therefore, that to him is historical memory. But a while ago, I said that beyond local histories, we should take into consideration the broader context, that there's the province, there's the region, there are policies that trickle into villages, the effect of policies, even in remote villages. There are international developments. In one community, for instance, that we visited in the Cordillera, it was very remote to even imagine that there was a helicopter that would go to that particular area to transport the potatoes that would now be made as French fries in McDonald's. So all these developments we cannot ignore, but definitely we're challenged. If we have to contribute to a relevant national narrative, then let's look at regional and local histories. I think I will end my talk there, and I would now be ready to entertain questions.
Hello po, good morning po ulit. Maraming salamat po Dr. Florendo sa pagbabahagi po ng kasaysayan po ng Cordillera. No? Sa ngayon po, bago po tayo dumako sa question and answer, so nais ko lamang pong batiin ilan sa ating mga viewers today. Yan po, good morning po kay Ma'am Maria Alisa, Sir Nestor Concepcion. Good morning from Jessica Velasco, Bernard Talento Pagsugiron. Ayan, hi po kay Sir Jeff Estrella ng NHCP na nanonood po ngayon. At sa iba pa po nating kapwa-kawani po ng National Historical Commission of the Philippines. Yan, kay Miss Jacqueline Pagulayan Magboom, good morning po. Maraming salamat po sa lahat sa panonood ng live stream na ito tungkol sa periodisasyon sa kasaysayan ng Cordillera. So now, ibabalik po natin ang hapag kay Miss Ayesha Saysay.
Gusto ko rin pong batiin yung mga nanonood po na mga teachers natin through the Department of Education Facebook page. May nabas po kanina yung mga taga Iloilo, merong taga General Santos, merong taga Cotabato. Ayan. Good morning po sa inyong lahat at thank you po sa pananood ng ating Countdown to 500 online lecture for today. So ngayon po, dako po tayo sa question and answer portion. Ayan. So if ever may question po kayo, ibato nyo lang po ng ibato sa amin. Sa mga nasa Zoom, you may type your question sa Q&A portion ng ating Facebook and ating Zoom link, Zoom webinar. Tapos for the Facebook viewers, i-type nyo lang po ang ating mga question sa comment section ng live stream. For our first question, mula po kay ST. Ano daw po kaya ang challenges? Bakit hindi na isasama sa talakayan ang pagsama ng indigenous experiences at realities, example sa stream ng Filipino imagination or consciousness? 500 years para po palang overdue na.
Sasagutin ko ba yun? Sinasama na ngayon kaya ako nandito sa talakayang ito. But it's true. The history of indigenous peoples has been marginalized in historiography. But we really have to walk an extra mile to write local histories, and for indigenous peoples also to write their histories. Because sometimes we hear complaints like, oh, that's not, tagalabas naman yan na pananaw. An ethic view of history, indigenous people's history. So why not therefore write from an emic perspective, an insider's view? We always, when we go out, when the UP Baguio people go out for trainings on local history writing, then we usually encourage communities, groups to write their own histories. So yes, we have to be, it should be something relentless to produce history from the perspective of indigenous peoples. Bakit hindi sila kasama sa historiography? One, we have been too focused also on Manila. There's usually the view of being Manila-centric. And at the same time, of course, national history will not take into consideration this very distinct, the indigenous peoples. Effort po talaga yan.
Dr. Florendo. Jobs, sige.
Ayun, maraming salamat po sa pagsagot po sa unang tanong. Actually, meron po ako dito na akala po na 2 tanong. So yung una, mula po sa kasamahan namin kay Alec, mula po kay Alec. Ang tanong niya po is kung paano nakaapekto ang kasisayang lokal ng Cordillera sa pambansang pananaw sa kaigorotan. Dahil iba ang karanasan nila, nagkakaroon ng paghahati na nananatili sa pananaw hanggang ngayon. Yan po yung unang tanong.
Si Alec, estudyante ko yan dati. So it's the other way around, Alec. I think what you want to know is in what way would local history enrich national history? When we talk about national history, it doesn't have to be one that is assimilationist. In fact, we can talk about medyo masama rin kasi yung konsepto ng integration, sabi nila. Kasi pag integration, it's also assimilationist in terms of framework. But we can have a national history that takes into consideration diversification. Like, why should the concept of kaigorotan be contradictory to, or why should it contradict a national history? When you can, it's something like okay, you will look at national history as consisting of patches of distinct characteristics. So you bring in, for instance, Muslim history. Hindi mo naman pwedeng tanggalin ang Muslim history dahil naiiba. Ang konsepto ng naiiba would be very assimilationist. Do we have to be the same as Manila? Do we have to be the same as the other sectors to be part of national history? If there's Kaigorotan, let it stay as Kaigorotan and be recognized as such. So let's move away from an assimilationist perspective so as for us to be part of the national narrative. Okay.
So yun po, maraming salamat po. Parang naisip ko lang, naalala ko lang din yung isang lesson na aral ko sa CAS. So bakit nga pala hindi natin tingnan yung national on a local perspective? Kasi di ba pwede naman natin ipakita yung iba't ibang kasisanang pangkat etniko through showing multi-centrality or pagkakaroon ng multi-centralidad.
Okay, right.
Sa kasaysayan. So yun lamang po. Miss Ayesha, meron pa daw pong
Another question po dito, Dr. Florendo, from Bantayog. Good AM, thank you so much. In your experience as a teacher, what difference does it make to the young Cordillera student to hear of your theory on local periodization? What new insights or understanding does it generate on the young? As someone from the Bantayog ng mga bayani, I would like to know how helpful it is to recognize local heroes of Cordillera.
Nako, okay. May issue dyan ngayon. Here in... Well, I mentioned already about our offering of History 3 in UP Baguio. We have History 3 in UP Baguio, which is the history of ethnic communities in the Philippines. Now, there are many, it's without doubt, there are many Cordillera, many students from the Cordillera who arrive in the university and their idea of being in the university and surviving in the university is to be like the other students in the university. And usually when you say other students in the university, the majority would now be, because in UP Baguio, for instance, in terms of IP population, it's a bit... maybe it would be good to have already something like 20%, and we're already in the Cordillera. So the rest would be non-IPs. Now, what we would want IP students to cultivate when they enter the university, when they are in our classes and we take up IP history, is for them to be proud of their history, to be proud of their tradition. Instead of being apologetic, like we're backward, like we have to dress up like the rest, we have to eat out, go to the malls. So instead of being proud, for instance, of their of etag, magpizza na lang, ganon. They want to be like the majority in the university. That was my observation. So we'd like them to be proud. I mean, UP Baguio is proud that it is in the region and that its curricular programs highlight indigenous Cordillera indigenous history and society. So we want them to be proud, and as much as possible, maybe it's a tall order, we'd like them to go back to their communities, be teachers of history, and rectify whatever the national narrative has created in the consciousness of the peoples of the Cordillera. Ngayon, uunahan ko na yung Bantayog. Meron issue kasi ngayon dito sa Cordillera, the demolition of the monuments of local heroes to pave the way, I think, for a DPWH project. So this is in Tinglayan, Kalinga. So, well, let me say that that demolition is in a way also demolishing the history of the people of the Cordillera, of the place. In the first place, they put up those monuments because of the significance of those monuments to their history. It was a history of the struggle against the Chico Dam. So why should an infrastructure project now demolish that history that is significant to the village? So definitely, I'm glad that there's mention about having local heroes, because trying to find local heroes would also be a way to, would be a good focus of local history. I always amazed, or no, it makes me reflect that when I go around the Cordillera, of course every town would have a monument of Rizal. Then I would usually wonder, how do the Bontoc, for instance, regard Rizal? The Rizal monument is right there at the center of close to their market. Parang kung minsan nga parang, ano bang significance ni Rizal? Nandyan yung hintayan ng jeep, nandyan yung pinag-iiwanan nila yung kanilang mga baskets, yung kanilang pinamili. Yan ang katabi ni Rizal sa Bontoc. But there are also local heroes. I'm not saying they should not study Rizal, but what I'm saying is, there are also local heroes. I mean, you don't have to die in Luneta to be a hero, in other words. So there are, in the context of Cordillera history, there should be emphasis also on locating local heroes. Thank you.
Ayun po, maraming salamat po, Ma'am Nela. Last question na po, pinaka-last question na po. From Amram Jesron Inere. So, hi Ma'am.
Estudyante ko rin yan, ha?
Ayun. Hi Ma'am Nela. How indigenous people's history now address the gaps and spaces found in the national history?
Oh, gaps. Well, in a previous paper, I differentiated. I now put the writing of history to two. One would be the history of indigenous peoples. That's from an outsider's perspective. But indigenous peoples can also produce their histories. I now call that indigenous histories. Fill the gap in the sense that, well, it will really take an effort. You can take one approach is like when I teach national Philippine history, which is one general education course in college. Then you give examples. So if you can, you have the national narrative, or maybe a periodization, the general theme periodization, but you enrich that periodization with experiences, not only of indigenous peoples, maybe of other localities. That's why students can do small researches so that the discussion, for instance, of Spanish colonialism could be two-tiered or two levels, in the sense that you can ask them to do, okay, bring in local history material, what happened in your locality or what happened in this particular area during the Spanish period. And then you get to synthesize these local histories and look at the national narrative. So since history talks about discussing cause, effect, looking for causal relations, then there should always be some kind of a venue where local histories dialogue with the national narrative. That's possible. And it's very fulfilling and it's very enriching. So Amram, if you're teaching right now, then you can do that. Your knowledge of Northern Luzon history should be able to input into national history. Ganon. Thank you. Last na yun, ha?
So that was the last question po, Dr. Florendo. Ayan, Jobs.
Ayan po, muli maraming salamat po Dr. Florendo sa pagbabahagi po ng inyong saliksik tungkol sa kasaysayan ng Cordillera. So napansin po natin na ang kasaysayan ng Cordillera ay napaka-complex. Hindi siya basta-basta maibabahagi lang kung gagamitin natin yung mga nakagisnan nating pananaw o pamamaraan sa pagsusulat ng kasaysayan. Kasi di ba nga na hindi naman tuluyang napasok ng mga Espanyol ang komunidad ng Cordillera, no? So dito papasok kahalagahan ng paggamit ng periodisasyon lalo-lalo na sa mga historiador. Kasi kung mananatili tayo nakasandig, halimbawa sa pananaw ng kolonyal, na paano natin maipapakita yung kasaysayan na nakapaloob mismo sa komunidad ng Cordillera. Tapos sa mga sumunod na panahon o taon, naging hamon sa mga sumunod na henerasyon ng mga historiador kung paano may papakita ang kasaysayan ng mga indigenous peoples katulad ng mga taga-Cordillera. So silang naisasantabi ang kasaysayan dahil nga sa pambansang pananaw na ay mabibigyan puwang sa pag-usbong ng iba pang historiografiya katulad ng kasaysayang lokal, kasaysayang regional, na may pagpapanahon o periodisasyon na maaring bumangga sa kinagisnan nating historiografiya. At sa paggamit nito, maaring mapakita ng historiador na yung kolektibong pananaw na nakapaloob doon sa pangkat etniko na yun. So napakahalaga talaga na magkaroon tayo ng iba pang lapit sa pag-aaral ng kasaysayan ng mga indigenous people. So bukod doon, kanina nga nag-usap-usap kami tungkol sa Cordilleran subgroup, no? Alam natin na may iba't ibang experiences between pangkat etniko dyan. So instead na, ang takeaway ko, parang instead na ipakita natin yung pagkakaiba-iba nila, so why not ipakita natin na kung ano yung naging ugnayan ng bawat pangkat etniko na to sa isang partikular na lugar or isang partikular na panahon sa kasaysayan. So nang sa gayon, makita natin kung ano yung nangyayari sa kanila na maaari palang makaapekto sa pambansang kasaysayan natin. So, yun lamang po yung buong paglalagom ko para dun sa lektura ni Dr. Florendo. Ngayon naman po ay, Ma'am Florendo, meron pa po kayong pahabol po na ilang salita?
Parting words po.
Yeah, reaction lang dun sa iyong sinabi. I hope I didn't sound like something very separatist because it's true. We want to highlight the unique character of the Cordillera, but let's not forget that we also have that the Cordillera shared experiences. Yes, let's not also isolate the Cordillera. So I hope those listening now will take on the challenge of doing their local histories also. It doesn't only have to be Cordillera history or indigenous people's histories, but local histories all over the Philippines.
Okay po.
Ganon. Thank you.
Maraming salamat.
Dr. Florendo. Ako personally, mas na-appreciate ko yung local histories, mga regional histories, kasi mas focus tayo sa national so akala natin yun lang. Yung parang natin yung localities, mas marami pa tayong malalamang kasaysayan, especially like sa Cordillera, di ba? Hindi pala sila napasok talaga ng mga Espanyol unlike sa mga lowlands. Ayan. Once again po, thank you Dr. Florendo. Sa mga nanonood po, wag po kayong magsasawa. Marami pa po kaming countdown to 500 online lectures until December. Hanggang December na lang po ang countdown to 500 online lecture. Tingnan natin kung next year ay magkakaroon pa. Pero sa mga nanonood, meron lang po kaming ilang pang paalala. Ayan, sa mga gusto pong sumali ng Quincentennial Art Competition, na-extend po ang ating submission to January 6, 2021. Yun na po yung last extension natin ng art competition. So, yung mga artists po na gustong humabol, pwede pa po kayong humabol. Ayan, we're giving people chance na makahabol po doon sa art competition. Jukes, meron ko pa bang ibang paalala?
Yan, bukod sa Q-Art competition natin, extended din po till January 6, 2021 ang Lapu-lapu National Monument Competition. So, sa lahat po ng artists na gusto pong magpasa, pwede po kayo magpasa via online. So, para sa iba pong impormasyon, pumunta lamang po tayo sa website po ng NQC. Yan. Hanggang ngayon po ay tumatanggap pa rin po kami ng mga artworks ng mga kabataang nasa edad 7 to 12 years old para sa Batang Bagani Kiddie Art Project. So kung gusto niyo po yung makita kung ano yung ilang halimbawa po ng mga artworks na naipasa na, pwede po kayong pumunta sa Facebook page po ng National Quincentennial Committee. Yun din po, pwede na rin pong downloadable na din po from our website ang Quincentennial Paper Dolls. So may iba't iba't tayong furniture doon na mga karakter katulad nila Humabon, Raha Humabon, Lapu-lapu, Magellan, syempre si Catriona Gray. Dahil nirepresenta niya ang pre-colonial na pananamit noong Miss Universe. Yun siya yung pinambato natin sa show.
Ba yan? May Cordillera model din ba yung dolls ninyo?
Parang mas focus po siya dun sa Pigafetta manuscript na characters, ma'am.
Okay.
Opo.
Nice ko lang banggitin na yung NQC, meron ding mga binabalak na regional conferences next year. And hopefully, I don't know how we will do it. It could be a webinar, but who knows, we can have a bubble conference on Northern Luzon. So that would include Cordillera history. Salamat.
Okay po ma'am, salamat din po. And ini-invite din po namin ang mga kababayan nating may hilig or magaling kumanta o tumugtog na sumali at magpasa po ng kanilang video ng ng Bagani. So, Himig Bagani Song Cover. Ang Bagani po ay ang team song ng 2021 Quincentennial Commemorations in the Philippines. And lastly po, wag po natin kalimutan na i-like and i-share po ang Facebook page ng National Quincentennial Committee, facebook.com/NQC2021. Also follow at NQC2021 on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, National Quincentennial Committee, for more educational materials. Follow also our playlist on Spotify, The 500 Years Philippines, to access the official soundtrack of the Quincentennial Commemorations. Yun lamang po, muli maraming salamat sa lahat. At magkita-kita po tayo sa susunod na Countdown to 500 online lecture sa November.
Maraming salamat.